Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new quilting basics video. In our last video, we learned a lot about preparing our fabric, squaring it, and cutting accurately. In this video, I want to teach you the next step, and that is quilt piecing. So let's learn how to do this. We're going to piece a simple 4-patch block together, learning how to piece accurately and how to match seams. To get started piecing, I like to put my Supreme slider here at the front of my machine. This just helps me to slide those pieces straight in the machine. And then the first thing I stitch through is just a little scrap of fabric. This is about maybe 1.5 inches wide, maybe 2 inches long, and I folded it in half. And I'm just going to stitch right through it. And this is what I call a scrap charger. And what it does is it lifts the foot slightly, so that way it's kind of at a nice height for piecing. It also, if you're going to have any kind of stitch issue, maybe your bobbin thread's going to tangle up, something like that, at least it's going to happen on a scrap and not on your actual pieces of your quilt. Now let's talk about the settings of the machine. I like the needle to end up in the down position, so I select that button and I lower my stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters, and that produces a very tight, secure stitch, and that's really important. You want these pieces to be locked together super securely. You don't want them to come undone. You don't want the piecing to come undone. So now I have 2 squares that we cut in our last video. These are 2.5-inch squares. And what I'm going to do is just take a second here to line these up, make sure that those edges are in perfect alignment. I don't want one slipping out from underneath the other. I want the top edges to be in alignment as well as those bottom edges. You can see I can take a few stitches off that scrap charger and just have the needle down, and then I can lift that foot. I'm using a knee lifter here to lift that foot and slip those 2 little squares under. And I'm slipping it in so that the very next stitch is going to be right onto that fabric. So now I'll start stitching. And I'm keeping, this is a 1/4-inch patchwork foot, and I'm keeping the edges of those fabrics in perfect alignment with the edge of that foot. And so that's giving me a very accurate 1/4-inch seam allowance. So now I'm coming up on the end. I'm going to take 2 stitches off, and then I can go grab 2 more squares to put together. This is called chain piecing. And basically you have your pieces together, and then the thread between them kind of becomes a chain. So here I'm going to do the exact same thing. I've stitched 2 stitches off of those pieces. Now I'm going to lift the foot ever so slightly with my knee lifter. If you don't have a knee lifter, you can reach back behind and just use your presser foot lifter bar. That's fine too. So I'm just lifting it, sliding those pieces in, and then now the very next stitch is going to be on those pieces. If I feel like one piece is slipping under the other, I'll sometimes just lift it up and just double check it, making sure that those edges stay in nice alignment. And I'm also making sure that over here, along the edge of the foot, that the fabrics aren't slipping out this way or slipping under this way. This is why I like patchwork feet that don't have a guide of any sort, because oftentimes that guide will block your vision and you won't be able to see if the pieces have slipped. So now let's do that one more time. This is our last stack of squares. I'm going to stack them together again. And this is exactly how I would chain piece if I was working on, something real. If I wasn't doing a tutorial video, this is exactly the way I piece. Stack things together, take a minute to get them nicely aligned, slip them under the foot. And then once I feel comfortable and I know that everything's in good alignment, I can put my foot down and go with a little speed. But I never go too fast because I'm always going to stop and check after every couple of stitches just to make sure that it stays nice and accurate. When I finish a chain, I'll grab either another scrap charger or I'll clip off the first one and stitch back through that. And that just keeps the thread nice and organized. It keeps the machine, in the stitching mode kind of, and it also reduces bobbin thread and top thread waste. You can see I just stitched through that little bit and I don't have those long, messy thread tails all over the place. So now we end up with this chain of pieced units. I'm going to clip these apart. We'll take them to the pressing board and learn how to deal with our seam allowances next. The next step is to press the seam allowance open. So I finger press it open first. And that means that I just use my fingertips to open that seam, and then I actually run my fingernail along it to make sure it's nice and flat. Then I hit it with my iron. And I do this to reduce the bulk of that seam allowance, so it's going to rest nice and flat. It also makes it possible to stitch right in that ditch whenever I'm stitching in the ditch in quilting. Now, a lot of people ask me about this, if I'm able to press the seam allowance open and stitch right in the ditch. And the reason I'm able to do that is because I lowered that stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters. It's a very tight, secure stitch, and it allows me to stitch right in the ditch, and there's going to be no risk that these pieces are ever going to come apart. They're almost impossible to rip apart at that stitch length. Now, why do I bother to finger press? I know a lot of people will just go at this straight with their iron and try and dig open that seam with the tip of their iron. Well, I can feel that that is not actually as flat as it could be. And by running my fingernail along it, I'm really encouraging those fabrics to lay flat and that seam to be completely flat and open. And I find that when I don't do that step, a lot of times I'll have kind of almost a lip of fabric on one side or the other. So I always finger press first, drag my nail across it, and then I hit it with a hot iron. And I do use a hot dry iron here. I find that steam oftentimes makes the fabric too soft, and it softens up my starch. So I always use a hot dry iron. Unless I'm doing something funky with fabric manipulation, I pretty much always use a hot dry iron, and that also makes my irons last a lot longer too. So now let's learn how to match seams. We want to make a 4-patch, and a 4-patch is just 4 pieces put together like this in a checkerboard pattern. So I have these 2 pieces already done. I'm going to flip over that top one, and now I'm going to work to match these seams. And what that means is just making sure that where one seam line comes together with another seam line, that they're going to match up just exactly right in that spot, and it's not going to be off like that to either side. It's no big deal. This is something, if you piece this and it's not perfect the first time, please don't get frustrated. This takes a lot of skill and a lot of practice and a lot of patience. And it took me years to be able to piece every seam just right. And every once in a while I'll have a bad day and something won't come out just right. So keep that in mind. Piecing is always an evolving process. So here's how I do it. I pinch the pieces together with my index finger, my middle finger, and my thumb. Pinch them together real hard and make sure that they're dead set right on top of one another. Then I fold that back and I place a pin right before that seam. That's going to lock it in place. Now I make sure that those edges are in nice alignment. I can take it to my machine and stitch through it. So when I get the pieces to the machine, I just take a second to make sure they're in nice alignment and slip them right under the foot so that the next stitch is going right onto those pieces. I'm going to stitch all the way up to my pin, and I'm actually going to get really close to it so that I could potentially stitch through it if it took one more stitch. Another thing I like to do is flip up the fabrics and make sure that those seam allowances are staying nice and open, that they haven't flipped over. The Supreme slider right here in the front really helps with that. It keeps everything sliding in one direction so that the fabrics don't accidentally flip over. So I've stitched right up to that pin, and then I take it out. The reason I don't stitch over it is it's very easy to hit that pin dead on and then break your needle. And then that can also cause some issues with your machine. It's not the end of the world, but I try and avoid it if I can. So after I stitch over that seam allowance, I just focus on keeping those fabrics in nice alignment all the way down and off, and then back onto a scrap charger. Notice how that's always a pattern. I always stitch from a scrap charger onto my pieces and then back onto another scrap charger. And I keep these handy right near my machine, so that way it always keeps my thread nicely organized. So just like before, we're going to press the seam allowance open with our fingertips and then hit it with our iron. And this results in a nice flat seam allowance. I keep saying that word flat, and it's important because as you're stitching, as you're quilting over this, you're going to be running into many more fabrics. So over here, you're stitching through one layer of fabric. Over here, with 2 layers of seam allowance, you're stitching through 3 layers of fabric. So it's really important that this is nice and flat. And look how beautifully these fabrics came together. Now, the ultimate test to know if your piecing is accurate is to measure it. So I regularly take, whenever I'm piecing, I will put a ruler on top of my unit and double check it. And this unit should come out at 4.5 inches. And that's just the simple math of quilting. We cut our squares at 2.5 inches, okay? Then we took away a 1/4 inch from both pieces. And so we'll end up at this point with 4.5 inches. All quilting has this very simple math. We add seam allowance, and then in the piecing process, we take it away. Now, what happens if your block ends up too big? You know, maybe it measures 4 5/8 or 4 3/4. If it's too big, then that means that your seam allowance that when you were piecing was too small, and you need to piece more accurately, exactly 1/4 inch. If you found that your block was too small, maybe it came out at 4 1/4 or 4 3/8, then that means that you're stitching with too wide a seam allowance and that you're taking away too much of the fabric. So get back on track with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And as for thread, I like Aurifil 50 weight Mako cotton. It's very, very thin, it's strong, and it takes up very little space within that seam allowance. So you're not losing space and losing your measurement because of thick, chunky thread. So keep all of these things in mind. Quilt piecing is an evolving process, and if you don't find that your pieces match together perfectly the first time, don't get frustrated. It can take years to get this right, but I absolutely believe that this is a building process. It starts with good fabric preparation, then it combines with accurate cutting, and then finally precise piecing and matching seams carefully. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning more about quilt piecing. If you have any questions about this process, definitely ask in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, definitely subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any new videos coming out every week. Until next time, let's go quilt.